Today, the first step in our discussion is going to be to take the analysis that we did last time, and we talked about how a perfectly competitive firm facing a market price, because it's too small to be able to influence the price to change it itself, takes the market price as given and then maximizes profit by choosing an appropriate output level that sets price equal to marginal cost. All right, and we worked through that particular relationship last time and showed, using the cost curves for an individual firm, what that profit maximization is going to look like. Okay, today we're going to first start by, we're going to kind of do a couple of different features and factors of this perfectly competitive market and kind of work through some of the implications of this particular setup. Okay, first thing we're going to do though is talk about how to derive the market supply curve. And this is the standard fare in economics courses, is to talk about how markets work by presenting a supply and demand curve. And we're going to work with these in a big way for the rest of the course. So it's important to recognize kind of where the supply curve comes from and what assumptions are incorporated in order to generate a market supply curve. Okay, first of all, what is a supply curve? First bullet point here. Supply curve is a relationship between the market price and the quantity supplied to the market by all of the firms. All of the firms make it a market supply curve. We're going to start today by first imagining what an individual firm supply curve will look like, and then we're going to aggregate that individual supply to all of the firms in the marketplace to create an aggregate or market supply curve. Okay, second bullet point here I want to highlight is that this is kind of a hypothetical kind of exercise that we're doing, because we're going to identify possible quantities that will be supplied at prices that are possible or that might occur. In deriving or writing up a supply curve, we are not instructing anyone as to what the price actually is. We're simply imagining if the price were P1, then the quantity supplied would be Q1. If the price were P2, then the quantity supplied would be Q2, and so forth and so on. But all of it starts with an if. If the price is thus and such, then the quantity will be something else. All right, it's not telling us yet until we merge supply and demand together. Only then can we start to talk about, well, what will the price actually be in the marketplace and how will that actually come about? Okay, and that's the last bullet point. The actual price occurs at the equilibrium, which is going to be defined as where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And we're going to have much more about this later and talk a little bit about why that price that comes about at the intersection of supply and demand, why that price and quantity is indeed an equilibrium. All right, for now, just take it as a given. Intersection supply and demand, that's where the price is going to gravitate to, and that's what price we would expect to come about in a perfectly competitive market setting. Now, deriving a single firm supply function. Okay, where does supply come from? So first of all, go back to the fundamental. A perfectly competitive firm, PC firm, chooses quantity little q such that price is equal to marginal cost. All right, so let's take a look at this hand-drawn diagram here that I've done. We've got a cost functions, average cost and marginal cost, indicated for an individual representative firm. So remember, whenever we draw this diagram now, we're not talking about the entire supply or the entire market. We're talking about just one out of the many, many, many firms that are supplying this product to the marketplace. Right? And this is what we'll imagine their cost curves look like. By virtue of having these cost curves, by having a U-shaped average cost and an upward sloping marginal cost that crosses at minimum average cost, those are the two features. By virtue of writing the marginal cost and average cost this way, we have incorporated the fact that there are fixed costs in production, that there is increasing returns to scale at low levels of production and decreasing returns to scale at higher levels of production. It is those assumptions which allow us to draw the marginal cost and the average cost in this particular way. So it's important to always remember, and that's one thing I'm highlighting in this course, is that these curves have assumptions underlying them, and it generates the reason why we draw them in this particular way. All right, so let's say we have a representative firm with an average cost and marginal cost that looks like this, and we would ask some questions like, suppose that the price were P3, then what would the firm decide to produce? Well, if the price were P3 up here, we would take that price, find where it's crossing marginal cost, and it would determine a quantity Q3. So just following the rule of thumb of the firm, if the price is P3, then the quantity supplied by the firm is going to be Q3 on the graph. If the price is P2, a little bit lower, then the quantity is going to be Q2. If the price is P1, a little bit lower, then the quantity is going to be Q1, and so forth and so on. All right, so what we can see is that from an individual firm's perspective, this marginal cost curve turns out to be the supply function for the individual firm. In other words, we can just kind of take this marginal cost and call it S for the individual supply of the firm, because this is plotting out a relationship between a price that might prevail potentially in the market and the quantity that this individual firm is likely to sell to the marketplace in order to maximize its profitability. All right, so that's our first step. We now have a representative firm supply function and have recognized that it's just the marginal cost curve for the individual firm. All right, next step. How do we get to the derivation of the market supply curve, the entire market itself? All right, this is going to require, and I like this graphic because it's got all sorts of, it's like one of those graphics you'd find in a book somewhere where you can spend an hour just kind of studying all the stuff that's on this page. All right, well, let's kind of see what we're doing here. Notice that on the left-hand side, I've got an average cost and a marginal cost curve drawn again, and I've got something above it listed as firm A. So firm A is just one of the many representative firms that are in this marketplace. Now, right next to it over here, we've got firm B. Firm B, notice, looks exactly like firm A. The cost curves are at exactly the same levels. The minimum is at exactly the same price. Everything looks the same. And that's an assumption we're making in this particular market setting. We're imagining there's many, many firms, but each of these firms are identical to each other. They have the same cost structures, the same ability to produce the goods, and so forth and so on. So we're imagining a kind of symmetry with all of the firms identical to each other. But these first two curves here are just two of the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of firms that we imagine are supplying the product in this particular marketplace. So how do we get to the market supply over here on the right? Well, we're going to get there by summing up the quantities that individual firms will make across the N firms, N being the total number of firms that are supplying the product in the marketplace. All right, so coming down here on the bottom, we've got this notation. Capital Q1, which is going to be the market quantity that's supplied overall at a price of P1, which is listed here, is going to be found in the following way. Q1 is going to be equal to, first of all, Q1A, the amount produced by firm A, plus Q1B, the amount supplied by firm B, that's here, plus C, plus D, E, F, G, all the way out to the nth firm, where N again is in the thousands. So we're adding this up across lots of different individual firms to get this, which is the summation of the Qs across all the individual firms. I equals A all the way up to N, which is the total number of firms available. So writing that out, we can describe that as the horizontal sum, meaning we're adding the quantities on this particular axis and adding them up to get the Q1 over here. Notice also that when I'm talking about little q's over here, I'm thinking of them in the thousands, okay? That this Q is small amounts of the product being supplied. While when we get over to the capital Q's over here, we're talking about production or supply that's in the millions. So we're adding up across the thousands or tens of thousands of firms, or even hundreds of thousands of firms, to get the total supply in the entire marketplace. Okay, so what do we get? Well, just like we get an upward sloping marginal cost curve is the supply curve for the individual firms, this supply function here in the market is going to be just the horizontal summation of the marginal cost curves. Now I've got it written up here as summation marginal cost. And technically speaking, it's not the marginal cost we're adding up. We're taking the inverse of the marginal cost, because what we're adding up together are the quantities on this axis, not the prices or costs that are measured on the vertical axis. So we're not summing up these marginal cost curves this way vertically. Instead, we're summing them up this way horizontally. And that's why we're saying we're not actually adding the marginal costs itself. We're adding the inverse, measuring the quantities instead of the prices or costs. All right, and that's how we get this market supply curve that corresponds to all of the supply that's going to come at different prices that might prevail in the economy. Okay, so there you have it. That's how we get a market supply curve. Now, just one interesting side piece that we're going to come back to and highlight a little bit more later on. But when we say the firms take the prices given, that they don't have any control over the individual price, we should ask, well, where is that price kind of being generated? Where is it coming from? And the answer is here. It's coming from the market. The market is determining what the total supply and demand is and will adjust its price accordingly, we imagine, so as to balance or equalize the total supply of the product with the total demand for the product. And that will only happen with a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. It's only going to happen at one price. So there will be just one price that will generate the market equilibrium. And it is that price that then ultimately gets fed back to the individual firms here, who then take that price and determine what they will actually produce in the marketplace at a particular point in time. Here's just a summary. Supply curve displays a positive relationship between price and quantity. As the price rises, the market supply rises as well. All right, so we've got a positive relationship we're positing between the price and quantity supplied in the marketplace. Another way to say that same relationship is to imagine that firms are going to require a higher market price in order to induce them to supply more to the marketplace. So if we want to ask, how do we get more supply of a product out there? One simple answer in a perfectly competitive setting is generate a higher price. Higher prices will generate an inducement for the individual firms to supply more to the marketplace. All right, and that's just kind of an intuition then behind the market supply curve. But you also can see now where that supply curve is coming from. All right, now the next question I want to address is, why is the supply curve positively sloped? And, you know, we could just sort of step back and say, oh, well, it kind of makes sense intuitively that, you know, firms would need a higher price in order to induce more production. But there's actually a fundamental reason why the supply curve is positively sloped, and it comes from the analysis of the cost curve that we've done previously. So the first answer to the question, why is it positively sloped, is going to come because we know that the marginal cost curve is positively sloped. And the market supply is just the horizontal summation of marginal costs. So if the marginal cost is a positively sloped line, then so will the market supply curve. Okay. But why is the marginal cost positively sloped, we might ask? Well, that gets back to the fundamentals of where that curve came from and how it turned into a positive slope. And here I want you to recall a couple of things that we presented a week ago or so. And what you learned is that, first of all, if you have increasing returns to scale, you're going to get declining marginal cost curves. They're not going to be increasing, they're going to be decreasing instead. You also did an exercise. We had constant returns to scale and fixed costs, and that generated fixed or constant marginal costs. So you didn't get an increasing marginal cost with constant returns to scale, nor did you get them when you have fixed costs in production in the early stages. All right, so where does that positive slope of the marginal cost come from? It turns out that it has everything to do with the assumption of eventual decreasing returns to scale in production, or a falling marginal product, which is the definition of decreasing returns to scale. All right, it is that feature of the production process that eventually leads that marginal cost to rise up and intersect that U-shaped average cost at its minimum. Okay, so that's the fundamental reason why the supply curve is positively sloped. You have to have this assumption of decreasing returns to scale in there in order to get that positively sloped market supply curve. Now, what does decreasing returns to scale mean again, conceptually, or I should say intuitively? It means that producing more is going to cost you more. It actually takes increases in the amount of labor or inputs into the production process generate declining increases in output. Output increases, but at a slower and slower rate, meaning, in essence, that it starts to cost more to produce more. And remember, one of the reasons I gave for why decreasing of returns to scale is going to set in, we imagine, in most production or perhaps all production processes, has a lot to do with congestion effects. Congestion occurs when you've got too many resources squeezed into a limited amount of space trying to produce a particular good. And eventually, you're just not going to get an improvement in efficiency or an improvement in output if you're trying to squeeze a lot of resources together in a limited space, for example. Okay, so that's in essence the reason why that marginal cost is upward sloping, and it's also the reason then why the market supply curve is upward sloping. It also kind of gives us the explanation for why firms require a higher price in order to supply more, because the presence of decreasing returns to scale, it means that it's actually costing them a little bit more to produce more, and that's why they need to get a higher price in order to induce them to supply more. Okay, so the purpose of this exercise is twofold. One, to explain why the supply curve is positively sloped, but two, to also emphasize how the assumptions we make about the production process feed into the curves that we're drawing and the shape that we're giving these particular curves. And what the modeling allows us to do is to identify the fundamental reasons for these relationships to be as they are. Okay? Now, sometimes those fundamental reasons will turn out not to match perfectly with the real world, but sometimes they will match pretty well with the real world. And so this isn't always an explanation of the world is always like this, but that the world is likely to be like this in many circumstances, especially when these particular assumptions are fulfilled in the world.